All right, how's it going, y'all? So today we're going over a critical video, and that is very simple steps that everybody should take to avoid ransomware on their Synology NAS. These are simple settings that you can take that will not negatively affect how you use the NAS and will give you incredible ransomware protection, really without having to do too much in your current workflow. Before we go into setting all this stuff up, let's talk about what ransomware is. And there's kind of two different forms. There is a crypto virus, and then there is actually extortion with your files. We're really going to be focusing on the crypto virus side of things. This will help with the extortion, but most of this stuff is going to be focused on making sure that you can always recover your files no matter what. It is a lot more difficult to make sure nobody else can access your files to a further level because that requires additional things. We will go over all that here. So what a crypto virus is effectively hackers compromising a computer on your network or even directly brute forcing their way into your NAS and then running a script that encrypts all the files it has access to. By far the most common way that this actually occurs in real life is somebody gets a virus on their computer. Maybe they download something from a website. Maybe they get a phishing attack with an email and it executes something. This script then goes through and finds every single drive and volume that it has access to. And generally it's attacked a computer, and that computer probably has mounted the SMB share of the Synology NAS. And it's just going to start encrypting files, every file it has access to. The exact same thing happens with external hard drives, and it is a very common attack. And that is why it's really important to secure your files and all of your computers. We are going to go over how you can also reduce risk on that, but this is really going to be focusing on how to make sure the Synology itself is protected and effectively treating your users as hostile employees who you do not know what could happen, and you kind of almost assume that they have a virus on their computer at any given time. In general, the Synology itself does not get hacked. There have not been any exploits that I know of since like 2011 that have directly attacked the Synology. The ones that did as well were the fact that people would open up their NASs with a username and password of admin, the admin, to the internet because they updated DSM and that was the default username. And so that's why they actually recommend disabling that. But in general, we are focusing on the fact that a computer is probably going to be the one who's actually encrypting the files. Though we still will, now with DSM 7.2, have additional protection for some NAS units, and we'll go over that in a minute here. And so there are going to be two different ways we are going to protect ourselves here. One is we are going to limit access and hopefully reduce the chance that this ever occurs. And two, we're going to make sure that even if the worst happens, we can recover from it. For the most part, you do not have to buy any new hardware to do this. With one asterisk on that is you do require a NAS with a BTRFS volume. So that is generally not the J models. And some people, I did it myself when I bought my first Synology way back in the day, set up their models with ext4 instead of BTRFS. Unfortunately, if you do not have a BTRFS volume, you're not going to be able to do the majority of this. We'll still go over some things you can do and just basic practices. But the really great part about this, that's an incredible undo button for everybody, is not going to work for the models with only ext4 volumes. For business users using the Synology as an office file server, I genuinely would recommend using the NAS you've currently got that's a J model as a backup and switching over to a NAS with BTRFS, because this is one of those features that has an unbelievable undo button to your entire NAS, and you can undo a employee getting mad and deleting everything and corrupting everything and writing over things, all in the snap of a fingers. None of this replaces a backup. It is critical to have a backup, but these are steps you can do without investing any more money to actually be able to have very good ransomware protection, though have a offsite backup if at all possible, or at minimum, get a USB external hard drive and set it up as a hyper backup destination, which will get you a lot of the way there. So we're going to be focusing on this part of the video. How do you reduce the risk that your NAS gets hacked directly? And we're going to be focusing on ways that do not really impede the way you've been using your NAS. We can talk about some different security things here. We're going to start with some very, very, very basic stuff that every single person should do. So thankfully, Synologies are actually quite secure things by default. I've had clients who have actually exposed Synologies with a public IP address directly to the internet for years without changing any of the settings at all. And while I freaked out a little bit, nothing bad had happened. I looked through all the logs and everything was looking okay. So you do have that. The next thing we are going to do is we're going to go into Control Panel and we're just going to set up some really useful defaults. We're going to go into our security settings and we're going to make sure that under Account, we have at minimum adaptive MFA for administrator group users. What this means is if you're an admin login from outside of the local network, you will get a two-factor authentication email sent to you. Adaptive MFA is a great place that everybody should be at a minimum because it's two-factor without all the pain. And it's one of those things that doesn't require a ton of upkeep. If you are a more sensitive business, two-factor authentication, especially if you're accessing the NAS over the internet, I highly recommend at minimum for the administrator users. We can also just enable account protection. That is protecting you against a botnet account where multiple IP addresses are trying to brute force their way on in. And what this will do is say 1,500 different IP addresses, because there's a botnet, are all trying to log in with the same user to effectively brute force it. Well, those guys won't get blocked by auto block because they're different IP addresses. If that happens, this will automatically lock the account so nobody can sign into that username for 30 minutes. Really useful to have in the case where you're actually a high value target. Then we're going to go in the protection tab, and this is every single person should enable this. 10 attempts within 5 minutes. You do not need to make this 3 attempts within 10 minutes. You really do not need to go that level because this right here, to brute force with these settings, would take 2.5 million years with an 8-character random password to have a 50% chance of actually accessing it. It's just not going to happen. In general, auto block should be very basic, really chill, because if somebody's brute forcing their way in, you want them to get blocked. But having super restrictive stuff is not going to help you if the person's password generally was leaked, because if they have 100 guesses of the password and they're pretty sure they know it, they'll just do 1 per hour and play the waiting game. So it's not worth it to increase it anything past this because you're going to start blocking your users way more than you're going to be blocking legitimate people. DDoS protection is only necessary if you're opening this up directly to the internet. I generally do not recommend it. And so those are the super basic settings that every single person should be having at a minimum. The next piece is going to users and group and making sure that this user that is called admin is deactivated. So what this is the default system user, and you want to make sure that the admin user, the user labeled as admin, is deactivated. This is where stuff gets very complicated because Will is actually a group of the administrators. So he is an admin user as well. This is where it's kind of hard to explain. So we're going to say that anybody who's in the administrator group, those are people who have root privileges. And then this is the admin user. It gets confusing there. Make sure to disable the account labeled admin and then have your own account that is in the administrator group. In previous years, I also recommended creating a separate regular user account and an admin account for yourself, so an administrator account for yourself. With the addition of immutable snapshots, this is not nearly as crucial, and so I only recommend this for pretty serious businesses, just because it's a great security practice to kind of get in the habit of doing least privileges. But for smaller businesses and home users, it ends up becoming very confusing and a bit overkill. So with the immutable snapshots that have kind of eliminated 95% of the gain from that, I no longer really recommend that unless you are an IT group who actually knows about that and are comfortable understanding the differences. The next thing to do is come in here to your groups and go to your administrators and check your members. Everyone will have a minimum of 2 users in this group. The account labeled admin, which is deactivated, and the current account they're signed in with, because otherwise, if you're not admin, you can't get in here. One thing I have seen a lot of people do is they don't really understand permissions on the shared folders, and so they just add everybody to the admin group because that's what gets them the permission. I would highly recommend not doing that, because that is how you get yourself in trouble, and that's how you accidentally mess up. And now you've got 8 accounts who all have admin access to the NAS, and people can accidentally break things when they're admins. So I would highly recommend looking at your group of administrators, and people who do not need to be administrators should not be administrators. For more advanced IT groups, there's the delegate options as well, which is absolutely awesome. So you can really start giving people only the permission they require. That was an update in DSM 7.2. All right, so those are the users and group settings. Really useful to have there. Really focus on making sure that the admin user is disabled, and those who are in the administrator group are limited to actually people who need to be in the administrator group. Next up, we're going to go into file services, and we're going to go into some SMB settings right here. By far, the most important are this one right here. Your maximum protocol should be SMB v3. If you wanted to, you could also have this SMB v2. Maximum protocol does not really matter too much, but minimum protocol is critical. Do not have this be SMB v1 unless you absolutely know you have to, and then it's okay as long as it's very well firewalled off. But if at all possible, avoid using SMB v1, because there are known exploits to that service where if somebody gets access to a computer, they can start brute forcing their way in. So really disable SMB v2 unless you absolutely have to. And then the other one is do not enable NTLM v1 auth. That's another one of those things that has been shown, and it is easy to brute force NTLM v1 authentication. So once again, unless you absolutely have to, do not have this enabled. And if you do have this enabled, certainly under no circumstance should you have the SMB port open to the internet at all. But those are the critical ones within the SMB advanced settings. Under AFP, ideally you have this disabled because it's not getting security updates anymore and it is getting EOL'd. If you are using AFP, really you should look into getting off of it if at all possible. NFS should only be used if you know what you're doing and are able to VLAN off all the NFS traffic, because you don't want NFS traffic going on the main subnet, because you can get yourself in some trouble there, because in general, NFS does not have very good authentication. Generally use IP-based authentication with NFS, unless you really know your stuff with Kerberos, which I have not seen a single person actually implement. NFS should only be enabled if you are able to run it only on a secure VLAN where you trust every single client on there. And when you do that, also make sure it's least privileges. FTP, do not enable standard FTP unless you really have to and you know what you're doing. But if you are using FTP and you need to use one of the 3 FTP options, I generally recommend SFTP because it's pretty easy to use and it's FTP over SSH. If you do enable SFTP, make sure to have SFTP on a different port than your SSH port, or even better, just have SSH disabled. All right, so that is it for those kind of primary pieces. Now let's go into external access and we can talk about this. So Quick Connect exposes your NAS to the internet. Since 7.2 and beyond, it's now only using relay servers by default, so it's not super insecure, but it does now open up your NAS to the internet in a sense. There's a ton of large businesses that use Quick Connect all the time. And so I would not say you have to disable it, though if you're incredibly security conscious and you very rarely ever access your NAS from outside of your local network, disabling it can be very valuable. If you're a home user trying to make sure you've got access to it on your phone, keep Quick Connect enabled and don't worry about it. The next piece on this is your router configuration. So for your router configuration, if you have this set up here, you have used what's called universal plug and play. The FBI actually recommends disabling universal plug and play on any router you've got. So it's not really a Synology setting, but it is a general setting. Go to your router, your Wi-Fi router. If you know about a router, you probably know how to disable universal plug and play anyway. But go to your router, find the name of it underneath, and Google that router name, disable universal plug and play. UPnP is the other way it's written. What universal plug and play does is it allows a device on the network to open up ports to the internet without actually you doing it through the router. Super useful for things like Xbox Live, but you should disable universal plug and play and open up ports that you require and you know about, so that way you don't have random devices on the internet just opening ports willy-nilly. This has been a very common issue with other NAS providers who accidentally, without the user even intending to, opened up FTP to the internet and things like that. So if you're going to do port forwarding, you should know about port forwarding and you should be doing it manually. Back in the day, I used to use the router configuration just because it was easy to tell people with tutorials, but as things have gotten worse, I really do recommend disabling universal plug and play and figuring out how to do your own manual port forwarding. This brings us to the next part we want to talk about, and that is what is even open on your network. There are a bunch of things that people will open up to the broad internet, and that is the key way that people actually get hacked. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a browser, and we're going to do a port scan on our own local network. I'm going to talk through which ports you should be worried about if you see. So what I always do, and this is actually something I do at the beginning of pretty much every single session, is I open up a browser and just go to what ports are open. And then I like the one from UGetSignal. And we're just going to go ahead and hit scan all common ports. And what you ideally want to see is a bunch of red, meaning nothing's open. I do want to talk about what a lot of these ports are and which ones are a strong absolutely not and which ones are, okay, that's fine. So FTP at this point, do not open up. So if you have FTP, figure out what's FTP and disable it. SSH port 22. That is, if you know what you're doing, SSH is very strong. If you know what you're doing and you're using key-only authentication, it's the way most web servers are configured in this day and age anyway. So it's actually okay, but you should know what you're doing. Telnet, absolutely not. So port 23, no. Port 25, another. SMTP, absolutely do not. Port 53 DNS, do not. Unless you really know what you're doing and actually know how to run a DNS server and actually know that if you have a publicly exposed DNS server, it can be used in a botnet account very easily. If you don't already know that, definitely disable DNS unless you really know what you're doing and have made sure that there's no recursive queries able to be done on anything but a local subnet. I really would avoid it at all costs. 80, which is HTTP. There's a good chance that this is open if you've got maybe your browser settings are exposed to the internet. Not great, not terrible. This is what websites use in unencrypted traffic. Just look into it probably is what I would say. 110, POP3, only if you're actively running a mail server on your local network should you have that open. 115, SFTP, can be secure if you know how to run an SFTP server, would not worry about it too much. 135, absolutely not. 139, nope, do not open that up. That is part of the SMB setup. 143, once again, part of a mail server. Almost certainly you should not have that on unless you're actively running a mail server. IRC, nope. 443, SSL. If you've got a public website, same thing with HTTP, is not too much of a thing to worry about. Really, just make sure you know what it is and you know that that website is designed to be open to the internet. SMB is a strong no, because that is how people actually get hacked. One of the only ways I've ever seen somebody actually get hacked was SMB, because they had SMB exposed to the internet and they just got brute force their way in. Now there is auto block with DSM 7.2 for SMB, but unless you really, really, really know what you're doing and you've only got SMB allowed to specific endpoints and you're super security aware, you're probably not even watching this video, do not have SMB open the internet. Use a VPN server and run with that. Some SQL databases, do not have either one of those. Remote desktop, avoid at all costs. If you need to use remote desktop or VNC, go ahead and set up a VPN server and use that. And then PC Anywhere and Minecraft, up to you. All right, so those are the key ones. And a lot of those actually would not even go to your Synology, but those are just the ones to understand. One last thing to check out. Synology has a good article about what ports are used by DSM. And rather than talk about the ones that are not okay, I'm only really going to focus on the ones that are okay if you know what you're doing to open up. So, active backup for business 5510 can be okay to do if you want to back up devices. It is designed for the internet. I would avoid it if you can, but it can work. So, gray area 5510. Hyper backup destination 6281. That is pretty okay. It is designed for the internet. 5000, 5001, or if you change your own custom ports, that is okay. They are designed to be publicly accessible. That is not insecure inherently, but just realize that having those two ports open to the internet makes it so people can start trying to log into your NAS and see it. You'll probably get a bunch of logs of people trying to guess their way in. The thing is, if you look at those logs, most of them are going to be guessing admin. And so it's really not like your real risk. It's more scary than anything else. But that is just one thing to know. The mail service ones, once again, only if you're running a mail server and you know what you're doing. Big ol' absolutely nots of AFP and SMB. And then FTP also, no. NFS, absolutely not. WebDAV, if you know what you're doing, is a pretty good way. It's way better than SMB over the internet. The last one I'm going to go ahead and add in is Synology Drive Server, port 6690. That is used and is super powerful. If you're using Synology Drive Client and want to get faster speeds, that's the number one way to do it. That is okay. It is designed for the internet and is secured for that. And finally, any of the VPNs right here are all safe to do pretty much. I would honestly only do UPnVPN and just change a random port, but all of those are VPNs and designed for the internet. Other than that, there's nothing else here that really should be opened up to the internet other than SSH if you choose to do that. And you do know how to open up SSH to the internet securely. Most people, though, should not. All right, so that is the introduction on the ports. Ports are by far the most common way people get themselves in trouble because anytime you're forwarding a port, you are always opening up something to the internet. And so the fewer ports you open, and more specifically, the more secure things you open, the better. Security is pretty much a weakest link in the chain. If you have an open VPN server running, and then you also open up SMB to the internet, well, you're not getting any protection from the open VPN server because you've got this massive gaping hole in your firewall. And so those are the things to kind of focus on and making sure you know if any ports are open, why they're open, and what is accessible on them. All right, so those were the key settings to check out for making sure your NAS is secure. We're now going to switch over to going on the other side where if you do get hacked, how you can very easily recover from it. And that is using a phenomenal package called Snapshot Replication. Snapshots do not take the place of a backup. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to say it 100 times. You should be backing up your NAS. But if you don't, at least this is a little bit on the right direction. Still, if you can, at least get an external hard drive to back up your NAS. I will say that over and over again until the end of time. Please back up your NAS, especially your critical files. But what we're going to do is we're going to install Snapshot Replication. And if you don't have it, it's likely because your NAS does not have a BTRFS volume. You need a BTRFS volume to use BTRFS snapshots. We'll just go ahead and install them. It's also going to pop up when you do it the first time. You need to do a replication service. Don't worry about that. Just say yes. I'm just going to go ahead and delete these two guys here really quick. These were from the last video I just filmed. So now Snapshot Replication is phenomenal because it allows you to get hacked and still protect your files. There are two different ways it actually protects you. The most common way, which I mentioned earlier, was a computer on the network gets a virus and starts encrypting files that it has access to. That's a pretty common attack, and it's something that's very hard for you to protect against yourself because now everybody's computer is a threat, and that is very, very difficult. The hardest part about IT security is doing that. What Snapshot Replication does is it allows that to occur, and it allows you to go back to how things were instantly. This is not only valuable for ransomware protection, It's valuable for anything. It essentially allows you to go back to how your files were at any given time, all incredibly quickly and without taking up a bunch of space. I get very common questions about how this works, and it is hard to understand fundamentally. It's a bit of black magic voodoo kind of stuff where it just kind of works. I'm not going to go over it in a super in-depth here, but effectively BTRFS is what's called a copy on write file system. So every single time BTRFS makes a change to any file, say you edit it, say you encrypt it, say you delete it, it doesn't actually delete, edit, whatever, the actual data on disk. Instead, what it does is it takes that change and saves it on a different part of the hard drive and just points to that next time. That is really useful for consistency. That's why they came out. But because of some really cool properties, that also allows you to essentially look back in time at exactly how your files were and recover them. It allows you to browse that Word document that you edited, how it was 3.5 hours ago, all without taking up a ton of space. So what Snapshots will allow us to do is Snapshots will allow us to get a computer on our network to encrypt every single file on the NAS that it has access to. And it will then allow us to have a one-click undo to go back to exactly how the files were 2 hours ago. The reason for this is the snapshots are stored as read-only. And actually with DSM 7.2, if you've got one that has immutable snapshots, they can actually be non-modifiable and non-deletable even by the root administrator user until a certain expiration date. Very powerful feature. So if that virus does happen and that computer starts encrypting all the files it has access to, it will not be able to touch the previous versions. Instead, you'll just be able to come back and say, boom, restore to how the files were 2 hours ago. I've covered this in a lot of videos, but we'll go over and set it up here. So right now, my volume is BTRFS. If we go into Storage Manager, we can see volume 1 is BTRFS. If you've got a Plus model and you just click through the regular settings, you almost certainly have a BTRFS volume. I would highly recommend it. So now we just come in here and we can choose to create snapshots on all of our folders. And we should create snapshots on all of our folders. The easiest thing to do is just Shift Select and add some settings. And I do want to say there's a couple of folders you may or may not want to snapshot. Time Machine folders and security camera folders are the two ones that are debatable on what you want to do. In general, with Time Machine folders, I will snapshot once a week and keep the last 2 snapshots. So that way, if something does happen, I can at least go back. And security cameras, it's up to you. For most people, they don't care if they lost their security camera footage, if something wild happened, but that is up to you on if you'd like to. These settings are going to be really for your regular Office file server kind of files. So we're going to go ahead and we've selected everything and we're going to go into settings and we are going to create a new schedule. Easy place to start that pretty much anybody can handle is all the time, take a snapshot every 2 hours. Then if you've got a model that supports immutable snapshots, you'll see this guy right here, and you can enable immutable snapshots. I do not enable immutable snapshots on video production houses NASs because they are people who quite often will fill up their entire NAS to 100% and need to delete files ASAP. If you do enable immutable snapshots, in this case 7 days, you will have to wait 7 days if you have to get your storage back ASAP. So that is the one thing. It's very powerful, but also can mean that you're waiting a few days to do anything. If you want to, maybe 3 days. It's kind of up to you. The immutability is not really required for everybody and can sometimes be more pain than it adds. But for businesses with critical files, immutable snapshots can mean a authenticated admin user cannot delete the files for X number of days. And this is a really cool feature because you can't change the date time and get it to and trick it into unlocking them. Anytime the NAS is not on, the clock stops. So there's not much you can do there. I've not seen anybody be able to beat it. So we will add immutable snapshots here. And now the most important piece is the retention settings. I normally do a custom policy. So we will keep that 2-hour granularity for 14 days. Pretty easy to recommend. So we'll keep all snapshots for 14 days. And so we'll be able to go back to how files were at 2-hour granularity for the past 14 days. And then for a regular user, we'll keep dailies for 30 days. What this is going to cost us in terms of space, it's not going to take up a bunch of extra space on our NAS. Instead, the way snapshots actually take up space, if you want to think about it like that, is they just don't let you get space back from deleted files for 30 days in this case. So the way this is going to work from a space perspective is every single time a file is snapshotted, it's going to be held on to how it was for at least 30 days in this case. That means if I delete the file, the file will be deleted from the file system as far as you can tell, but that space will be held on disk for 30 days because it is still referenced in that snapshot. And so that's why snapshots only take up space when you're making modification. The only time a snapshot will actually take up space, and by take up space, I mean hold on to space and not let it get back, is when you are modifying files and deleting files. Snapshots will never take up space if you're just adding files, because when you add a file, you are adding that file to the main file system as well, and so the snapshot does not take up any additional space whatsoever. These are pretty easy settings to recommend for most people. For businesses, especially ones who do not have a ton of data, I will often set this for 120 days and then weeklies for 104 weeks. Just because if you've got the space and you're not really having massive space requirements, it can be incredibly powerful to have the ability to go back to your file system how it was 2 years ago. But we'll go to a very simple, this works for just about everybody. And now, under advanced, make snapshot visible if you don't have encrypted shared folders. And now just hit OK. So now, instead of us waiting for the snapshot to occur, we can take a manual snapshot here. And we can kind of show you exactly how powerful this is. I'm now going to go ahead and map this Office files over macOS Finder. All right, so now right here, we are at a place where I've just mapped the drive via macOS Finder, and we can see that now there is this snapshot folder. This snapshot folder is going to be filled with timestamps. So this is the time zone I'm in, GMT -5, and then it is the date string, 2023-09-12. Then there is the time. So these are all the times that these snapshots were taken. And so this looks like I've got a ton of copies of my data. Each one of these looks like the entire file system exactly how it was when that snapshot was taken. So it kind of looks like you're taking up 800 copies of your data, right? You're not. It is not taking up much space at all because it's referencing the same space on disk pretty much always, unless there's been a modification. It's really hard for people to understand because it's a very complex, weird thing, but you just kind of have to trust that it works. And if you're trying to figure out how much space a snapshot's taking, you can always come in to snapshots, list, and calculate the size right here. And it will tell you exactly how much space that snapshots are taking. In general, it's going to be very, very, very small, on the order of a few megabytes or gigabytes, depending on when files have been deleted. This is the true power of snapshots. Let's say I am now acting as a computer virus and I'm going to just start modifying everything that we needed to. So the thing that's really tough about viruses is they don't delete the files. No, because if they deleted them, they go to the recycling bin. They modify them. They go in and they change the data to an encrypted file that only they can access. So I am essentially going to go ahead and do that. Do it on just 2 of them. And then what do you know? I'd say I deleted these. So now, say I try to do the snapshots. I try to open this up and edit one of these snapshots. The volume's read-only. I can't, as the virus, I can't modify these previous versions of files. So I'm unable to edit them. Now, all we have to do is we can just go in and undo this. This is the case where we got a virus and it encrypted all the files it had access to. Well, now we can just come back into Snapshot replication and go into the recovery menu and recover it. So this is that snapshot I took. I'm just going to restore to that snapshot. By the way, it's a great idea to take a snapshot before restoring as well, if you do get a virus, just so you can kind of undo stuff as required. And now once this refreshes, macOS cannot quite comprehend the massive change. So I just need to remap the folder. And voila, all my files are exactly how they were back before that happened. That is the power of these snapshots. And yes, it is for ransomware, but it's also so powerful for everything else, where this can allow you to just undo any changes. Say you accidentally save over a PDF or Word document or anything like that, you can go back to how your document was a few hours ago. There are so many powerful features that you can do here, and it is incredibly useful to have. A few other common questions I get from a ransomware perspective with this is, well, what happens if they fill up all the data and then they start deleting the snapshots? The thing is, snapshots cannot be deleted except in DSM and only non-immutable snapshots. And even ones that are non-immutable can only be deleted by an administrator. And so it's not like they can just fill up the space and it's going to delete the snapshots. No, the snapshots are effectively holding onto that space and will not let the file system fill itself up. Instead, it'll say, sorry, you're out of room. So that is one other common question. Really, it's pretty darn close to being bulletproof from a ransomware perspective when it's all about that crypto virus making sure you've got your files. A backup is still incredibly important to have, though these can absolutely work in tandem. All right, well, that's going to be it for this. Go and leave any other tutorials you'd like to see me make down in the comments below. And if you'd like to hire me for a project, there's a link for that down in the description below. All right, have a good one. Bye.